You never really notice when your life starts to rot. It doesn't happen in one clean, cinematic moment, no single explosion or crash. It starts quietly. A missed call. A lie so small you convince yourself it was nothing. Then another, and another, until the silence between two people who once shared everything becomes unbearable. My name's Michael Reed, 39 years old. I used to think I understood people. I worked in corporate investigations for a private security firm in Chicago. My job was literally to uncover secrets. I could smell a lie from across the room. But when it came to my own life, I was blind. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone, my wife, Claire, had been lying to me for over a year. It started with an unease I couldn't explain. I'd get home late from work, and she'd be on her phone, quickly locking the screen. The smile she used to give me was gone, replaced with polite disinterest. I told myself we were just busy, that marriage after 10 years naturally cooled off. Then one night, I found an email on her laptop. It wasn't what you'd call incriminating at first. No love confessions, no photos. Just a single line, Friday, same place. Don't be late. The sender's name was E. When I asked Claire about it, she laughed. It's just someone from work. Mike, you're getting paranoid. That's the problem with being an investigator. You know too much about how people lie. And when someone close to you starts using the same tactics you've seen 1,000 times in others, it's like watching a slow-motion car crash. I installed a tracking program on her phone. I know how that sounds invasive, wrong, but I needed the truth. What I found made my blood go cold. Friday night, she wasn't at the office like she said. She was at the Wellington Hotel, downtown, room 504. I drove there, parked across the street, and waited. The kind of waiting that feels like drowning. At 8:13 p.m., she walked out, laughing. Her hair was down, makeup redone. And right behind her was Ethan Carrington. My boss. The man who'd hired me 7 years ago. The man I'd trusted like a brother. He put his hand on her lower back as they walked toward his car. She didn't push it away. I sat there for 30 minutes, gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought I'd break it. The world didn't just fall apart, it quietly disintegrated. For 3 days, I said nothing. I went to work, smiled at Ethan, watched him shake my hand with the same calm confidence that made clients adore him. He didn't know I'd seen them. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was part of the thrill. Every look, every gesture felt different now. His casual jokes, his "we're family here" attitude. I saw the cracks. And underneath it all, a predator. I told myself I needed to be rational. Divorce her, quit, move on. But I built my career on one thing: leverage. And when someone takes from me, I don't walk away. I make sure they regret it. So I began to dig, quietly, carefully, not into their affair. That was personal. I went after Ethan's life. I hacked into his company laptop. Ethan wasn't stupid, but he was arrogant. He thought encryption made him untouchable. It didn't. Within a week, I had his private folders decrypted. And that's when I found it, a folder labeled Cobalt. Inside, financial transfers, encrypted emails, offshore accounts. The numbers didn't add up. Millions moved in patterns only someone with insider access could manage. Ethan wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was embezzling from the firm. And worse, using my name to cover some of the transactions. That's when something inside me snapped. I could have gone to the board, exposed him, saved my career. But revenge isn't about balance. It's about pain, about making them feel the same cold, choking helplessness you felt when you realized everything you loved was a lie. I started to build a plan, one that would destroy Ethan professionally, financially, and personally. But to do that, I needed evidence. Solid, undeniable proof. That's when I reached out to Marcus Hale, a friend from my days in cybercrime. He owed me a favor. I once kept his name out of a federal report. I told him I needed a shadow trace. Untraceable, silent, something that could follow Ethan's move without setting off alarms. Marcus didn't ask questions. He sent me a device, a small black box, disguised as a Wi-Fi extender. Once connected to Ethan's home network, it could siphon every byte of data without detection. Now all I needed was to get it inside his house. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Friday night, company mixer. Ethan was hosting. Everyone from the office would be there, including Claire. I smiled at the mirror as I adjusted my tie, feeling the old calm return, the kind of calm that comes before something violent. When I arrived, Ethan greeted me like nothing was wrong. "Mike, glad you made it. I was just telling Claire how we need more people like you around here." I could smell his cologne, expensive, overconfident. I smiled. "Always happy to be of service, boss." As the night went on, I slipped away from the noise and found my way upstairs. His study door was unlocked, because of course it was. Men like Ethan believe locks are for other people. I plugged the device into his router, tucked it behind a stack of books, and walked back downstairs like nothing happened. From that night forward, every secret he kept, every message he sent, every dirty transfer came straight to me. And what I saw over the next few weeks made the affair look like a minor sin. He wasn't just stealing, he was blackmailing. He had dirt on half the board affairs, debts, shady deals, all kept in a single encrypted drive, a drive that I now had access to. But here's the thing about revenge: once you start, you can't stop. It eats at you, reshaping you until the line between justice and obsession disappears. I told myself I was doing it for the truth, for closure. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a man chasing truth. I saw someone sharpening a knife. And when Ethan suddenly called me into his office one morning, eyes colder than usual, I realized something terrifying. He knew. When Ethan called me into his office that morning, he didn't pound on the door or make a scene. He sat behind his desk like a man who owned the room, leisurely, confident, as if the world was a chessboard, and he had already placed my king on the wrong square. "Sit," he said, palm flat on a ledger that looked suspiciously like one of my firm's internal audits. "We've got some irregularities." His smile had a blade under it. I sat in the guest chair and watched him close the door, with the kind of slow grammar some men use when they plan to teach a lesson instead of argue. The fluorescent light above hummed a lazy note. Outside, my colleagues went about their tidy catastrophes, phone calls, awkward small talk, the calm of men who never imagine the ground will shift under them. "Mike," he said, "you've been distracted lately. I hope everything's all right at home." I let the silence do the work. Ethan liked to believe he'd won already when he managed to put a man on edge. That was his arrogance, and arrogance that had once served him well. It would be the thing that convinced him to move like a man who feared exposure, rather than like a man who knew how to conceal it. "I'm fine," I said. "Why? What kind of irregularities?" He tapped a stack of printouts. "There are transfers in accounts that shouldn't be moving, vendor payments logged under pseudonyms, and, curiously, references to a cobalt ledger. Some client is moving assets in ways that look, objectively, criminal." He slid an envelope across the desk. My heart stayed quiet in my chest. My face, trained for many years in poker-faced interviews, kept its neutral line. "You didn't do this," he said. "It wasn't a question. Not to me, not to this company. But someone on your projects has been sloppy. I need full cooperation. I'm going to ask you pleasantly to hand over any files you're running that touch our vendor chain. No excuses." There it was, a fishing line disguised as an offer. He wanted my access, my logs, my scripts, anything that could show I'd been inside systems I shouldn't have been. If he found a breadcrumb tied to the cobalt folder, it would be easy to paint me as the man who took advantage of our resources. He wanted scapegoats. He wanted a signature he could forge. I could feel the device he'd set, and the rehearsed way he expected me to step on it. His eyes were bright, hungry for the opportune narrative. A man like Ethan loved the cleanup as much as the theft. Better to control the story than to risk the chaos of the unknown. Instead of swallowing, I did something else. I smiled. Of course, I said, voice even. I'll pull anything you want. But if this is about protecting the company, maybe, just maybe, we should protect how we hand things over. My team's been audited before. We do this right, transparently. He hesitated, and that hesitation cost him. Over-precision is a luxury that lives under the assumption that the other man is predictable. I knew his cadence. I had watched him for years. He'd never thought I'd play back in his court. Fine, he said at last, but I'll be watching your servers tonight. He left it as a threat and a promise. When I closed the door behind him, I opened the tiny black box tucked into my palm. For 3 weeks, that device had been loyal to me like a compact, obedient spider, ingesting, replicating, storing. It had given me Ethan's private folders, his offshore ledgers, the whole monstrous nest of cobalt. It had given me a map to rip apart. I called Marcus in the alley behind a sandwich shop and told him exactly what color of risk I wanted: slow corrosion, not violent collapse. I needed leverage in 3 places: his money, his pride, and his name. Marcus grinned in the way he always did when a plan smelled like money and consequence. You want him to die soft, Marcus said. We make him bleed in the boardroom, the bar, and the bedroom. Piece by piece, we worked like craftsmen. There's an art to revenge, the tempering of the blow so it's precisely painful, not fatal, in a way that creates sympathy. You don't torch someone's life so the world collapses into pity. You remove the supports underneath until they fall slowly and notice every crunch of wood. Phase 1, paper. I'd already had the files. Now I organized them into a dossier that read like treachery without a suspect. Offshore transfers, vendor invoices with slight numerical mismatches, a trail that led back to a shell corporation, Cobalt Technologies Limited, registered through a law firm in Jersey. I forged a pattern that suggested the embezzlement was systemic, not opportunistic. To make it believable, we included innocuous emails, meeting notes, the sort of bureaucratic language only insiders use. The trick is always to be boring enough that no one suspects the theatricality. I leaked the dossier anonymously to a couple of reporters who ate corporate scandals like sharks eat chum. Not sensational pieces, just the kind of precise accounting that makes compliance officers itch. The story rippled through investor lists. The trading desk at Helix murmured. Men with tiny fiduciary hearts called for calm. Ethan's bright eyes flicked at the news feed. I could see his pulse quicken in the angle of his jaw. Phase 2, the board. I sent a curated packet to several members of the board. Not everything, just enough to sow doubt. We used a courier service that left paper trails in places the board members would find credible, not overt. One trustee called the internal auditor. The auditor, hungry and procedural, pulled records the way a pit crew checks a car. By the end of the week, there were 3 auditors on a hunch and one very nervous CFO who started double-checking wire authorizations. Ethan began to sweat. I smelled it like ozone before a storm. He tightened meetings, canceled afternoons off, and called his old allies with the tone of a man who is trying to reassure himself. Phase 3, the personal. Ethan's pride is a fragile thing. Men like him sleep on a bed of earned reputations, and they are always terrified of being shown as ordinary. If his public face is stripped, he becomes small, petty, exposed. I was going to take that away. I hired a digital stylist to circulate a set of innocuous photos: Ethan at a charity gala, Ethan with a partner at a secluded beach, to the usual feeds. In their metadata we planted tiny errors that hinted at a different life: hotel receipts, a parking stub from a clinic, a cryptic calendar entry for an anonymous client, enough to make gossip start. A whisper becomes a rumor becomes a stain. Asterisk, asterisk. Between moves, I watched the man I'd once respected become smaller. The office hum changed. The jokes about quarterly numbers had a brittle edge. He stopped walking through the floor with the mine-like confidence he used to wear. He flinched when the phone rang. One evening, after the market took a small hit and a trustee asked pointed questions about vendor liquidity, Ethan stormed into my department and slammed a report onto my desk. "You're the one who leaked this," he said flatly, like a verdict. The suit he wore seemed to wear the authority he'd been born into, but his hand shook, and he covered it with the other as if embarrassed by human weakness. "I don't leak," I said. "I investigate." He smiled, but there was something feral now in the shape of the smile. "Don't make me come at you, Mike. You gave me a lot of trouble lately." His voice was an old familiar threat, but the risk had flipped. He exposed himself when he came with accusal but no evidence. That made him the one on the back foot. I let him go. Some men lash out because they have nothing left to lose. Others lash out because they fear losing it all. Athens was the latter. Asterisk, asterisk at home. Claire, my other life, became the crooked geography of this war. I kept her looped carefully. Dinners out where she could be seen with a man she thought safe. Messages that suggested diversion. I fed her small, safe lies, and she gave me honesty in strange, brittle moments. I knew she watched Ethan move like a cat watching a trapped mouse. Fascination layered over guilt. She never suspected how close at times we were to breaking, how the knowledge of betrayal had the strange property of sharpening you rather than softening. Then the first real misstep in my careful architecture came not from Ethan but from a man I half liked and fully underestimated. The CFO. He called me on a Saturday, voice low. "Michael," he said, "I'm being asked to sign off on an emergency transfer. It's small, meaningless to you, but big for us. Ethan says it's a freeze for a vendor." I don't like the dates. I told him to hold. I told him not to sign anything without my eyes. Procedures matter. Signatures matter. He faltered, then complied. A small mercy of men who still care about the integrity of paper. 24 hours later, an internal memo appeared. A forensic audit had flagged unauthorized sign-offs on the Cobalt umbrella. The CFO was on the cutting block. He stared at me in meetings like a man who has been chewed by consequences and wasn't ready to swallow the spit. The trap tightens necks. I did something cruel and surgical. I moved one of Ethan's confidants, a junior partner who handled the grittier operational contracts, into my orbit. She was careless, a person who liked corners and secrets like a child hoards candies. I fed her a tailored lie that an overseas client had called asking for a very, very discreet document that could be moved through a private locker. She loved the rush. She loved the idea of being the one who could fix a problem without calling the board. She took the bait. At midnight, she walked into a locker room and left a manila envelope that contained a single USB and a note. Proof for Cobalt. She thought she was playing hero. She thought she was saving the firm. She thought she'd be remembered. What she left was a breadcrumb trail the auditors loved. The locker registration used a name that tied back to a show in Jersey. The locker's CCTV showed her face clearly. The auditors traced the chain end like vultures to a fresh till the board moved. It was beautiful in its simplicity. It was pitiless in its result. By morning, the junior partner had been suspended. She burst into my cube, a face red with the combination of shame and betrayal that only people who thought themselves clever enough to be invisible display. "You set me up," she said, but the fury in her voice was for herself. She didn't believe a manager could be so cruel. She would later take a plea for cooperating evidence, and her voice would be a weak thing at board hearings. I held my face like stone. I had no guilt. I had method. Ethan's kingdom was shaking. He moved in circles, signing off on emergency transfers, calling in favors, trying to quarantine the infection. He was a man sprinkling disinfectant on a fire. The personal strike, they say revenge is best served cold. I'd prefer to orchestrate a slow, private drowning. So I arranged for his wife to receive a set of documents, details of those offshore transfers, but laid out like an infidelity file. We used transposed dates and hotel receipts mixed with bank logs so that when she saw them she'd feel the same private violation I felt. It is a terrible thing to weaponize privacy, but Ethan had weaponized dozens. His wife, A woman who had never suspected her husband of this depth read the documents and aged. Wordless dinners followed. He tried to apologize. She looked at him like a foreigner, and the way her eyes no longer held him was a wound I wanted him to feel every morning. The turning point, and then inevitably Maddox happened. Company lawyers sniffed the Jersey accounts and found a trace, a signature only a person in Athens' inner circle could have made. A name came up, an old consultant no one else remembered. The board demanded the air of governance. An outside firm was brought in. The press smelled paper. Ethan, once predator, now crouched like prey. He called me to his office one last time and slid a thin stack of papers across the desk. "I've got you," he said. "I can make this all go away." I looked down at the paper. It was a list of server IPs with logins, an attempt to intimidate by exposing me instead. But there was a delicate arrogance in the way he'd tried to play the hunter. He thought the knowledge of my access would make me silent. He was wrong. I picked up the phone after he left and dialed the number of a reporter at a regional paper, the one I'd used earlier. I told her in a calm voice about this shady file, about Cobalt, about a man named Ethan who preferred quiet cleaning to honest work. I sent her a copy of the Cobalt folder and a single sentence: "Follow the chain to Jersey. It's a helix of shame." By mid-morning the next day, a strip article landed on the industry feed. By lunchtime, the board had emergency suits in their offices. By evening, a trustee called for Ethan's resignation. He went to a meeting to explain and came out with a pale face and the sound of a life being circumscribed. He died a little in 3 weeks. Not physically, not violently, but every laugh lost its warmth, every handshake its ease. The man who had built an empire of small cruelties found himself standing on the edge of a ledge, fashioned by his own making. I knew I was close when he stopped making threats and started making phone calls to people who sounded like old gods, men with names like Trust Foundation, Donor. He tried to buy friends, call in favors, smear me. He hired lawyers. He tried to find the device. He moved servers. He paid for silence. And that's when I used him against himself. I released a second dossier, this one surgical: emails between Ethan and a known fixer, an invoice showing payment for reputational management channeled through Cobalt. It was the sort of paper that made people walk away from a man they'd once trusted, because reputations are fragile, and trustees call their lawyers when the word embezzlement whispers across their dinners. He did all the things a cornered creature does. He looked smaller. He cried at night in expensive hotels. He called his wife and begged. Once, when he saw me in the corridor, he spat. "You think you're clever. You'll pay." And I thought, in that clean, cold place where I kept my ethics, he already is. The board suspended him pending forensic review. The SEC opened conversations. The press circled. The man who thought himself untouchable now contemplated contingency plans and lawyers and personal failures. He was dismantled piece by piece. But the thing about dismantling men like Ethan is that the framework they use, the company, the shell companies, the unspoken deals, doesn't die with them. It wriggles. It adapts. A head falls, another grows. So I knew the work wasn't done. I'd set the stage. The board's whispers turned to action. Ethan was on the ropes. But the beast behind him, the one that had given him the idea that Cobalt and others like it were necessary, remained a shadow. If I stopped now, I'd have taken out a nest builder, but not the systems that build nests. That's why I kept a second file, crisp and quiet, hidden in a safe deposit box and mirrored to 3 encrypted clouds scattered across continents. It began with Ethan, but it didn't end there. It was a web of names that reached just far enough to touch people who made decisions in rooms with wood paneling and soft lights. It reached up, not down. I closed my laptop, sat back, and for the first time in weeks allowed myself a long exhale. The taste in my mouth was not victory. It was something heavier, like the iron of a blade that has been used outside, The city moved on indifferent. Inside, men who smiled in boardrooms were making calls to crisis PR firms and to lawyers and to trustees they thought they could trust. I'd given them a wound. The infection was the next chapter. When I got the message at midnight, no header, a single line. We see what you did. We aren't done. It felt like the beginning of the loom tightening again. Someone powerful had noticed a pattern. Athens' fall had announced me to hands I hadn't yet touched. I fed that message into my own system, traced its headers to a jurisdiction I didn't like the look of. I started a new file. Revenge had to be patient. It also had to escalate. There was a deeper architecture to pull people who paid men like Ethan to tidy messes, and then asked them to tidy again when blood hit the floor. Men who thought the world could be rearranged by transactions and not by consequence. I poured another bourbon, the glass sweating in my hands. The plan had worked. Ethan would lose everything he cherished, and probably more. He'd taste the slow collapse, and every morning would be a small humiliation. But a man named Maddox, or whatever name hid behind the payment string, still controlled more than one man's fate. I'd exposed the small predator, and in doing so made a bigger one notice. The game had become larger. The house I'd been building was no longer just a tool for personal revenge. It had become a siege engine. The next move would not be a set of leaks or a dossier. It would be a strike into the heart of that network. It would require other currencies, patience, allies who owed me more than favors, and the willingness to watch people I'd once trusted pay for my choices. I closed the ledger and slid the black box into a sock in the drawer. Outside, the city exhaled. Inside my chest, something cold and resolute settled in. I had started a war with a man who stole more than money. I had stirred a hornet's nest, and the hornets could sting in places I hadn't yet imagined, but I had one advantage they didn't. I had a map, and I'd seen the way the web wove. Tonight, I would sleep for an hour. Tomorrow, I'd start pulling the next thread. There's a difference between cutting a rope and unweaving a net. A rope snaps. A net reroutes the load. I'd thought I'd been cutting a rope. Turns out I'd been tugging at a loom stitched into the fabric of other people's lives. Every tug made the whole thing tighten, and every tightening exposed another hand. After Ethan fell apart, after the boardrooms and the morning after calls and the hollowing smile he wore like a ghost, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted like iron and watched the city pretend nothing had happened. But it had. Men who lived by quiet transactions noticed the tremor. Someone wrote me a single line. We see what you did. We aren't done. It wasn't a threat so much as a polite statement of fact. They had noticed the pattern, and they were recalibrating. My first move was the obvious, pedestrian thing every investigator does when the stakes rise. Follow the money until the money stops lying. The black box tucked behind Ethan's stack of biographies had given me account numbers, routing memos, and a name repeated enough to become a signpost. Cobalt Technologies Limited, Jersey registered, lawyers with nice letterheads, a cascading set of shell accounts that funneled to an unremarkable trust in the Caymans. Those trust accounts then micro-donated to a handful of charities with trustees who sat on boards, lobbied city councils, and made polite, decisive phone calls in rooms where people who mattered were seated. The ledger was clinical. Sums, timestamps, memo lines, consulting fees, retainer, stabilization. Whoever wrote those memos used language to make theft sound like diligence. That's the art in their trade. One line had an odd phrase, though, a signature token that didn't fit the clerical rhythm. Director C. Maddox. I circled it like a man circling a wound. Maddox. The name was an echo. It belonged to a rumor I'd heard in the background of other audits, a shadow financier who specialized in discrete risk mitigation. He wasn't on any publicly filed ownership records. Men like him sat behind layers of managers, trustees, trust managers. He was the kind of man who buys silence and calls it investment. If Ethan was a little shopkeeper stealing from his till, Maddox was the silent hand that supplied the tool to other shopkeepers. Taking Ethan down mattered. Cutting the supply mattered more. But cutting supply meant finding one wire that passed through a dozen jurisdictions and exposing it in a way that made trustees twitch. I needed to move smarter than they did. I needed to pull a thread so visible they have to react in daylight. I called Marcus first. He'd kept his nose in the right sockets long enough to know how to breathe under a vacuum. "You want Maddox," he said when I explained. "You don't find Maddox by asking. You force him to show his face. Net him with a bait that looks like opportunity but smells like threat." Marcus's inventory was a list of favors, rusty contacts, and one man in Zurich who owed him for a time Marcus had fixed the wrong laptop and not asked questions. Marcus smiled the way con men smile when a plan smells like money. "I'll make noise in the right wire rooms," he said. "You make someone panic. The panic makes the ledger start slipping." We built a bait that was both clumsy and irresistible. An apparent breach in a smaller front-end accounts payable system at a municipal contractor that looked like someone could write off a line and pocket change. Not enough to spark full forensic review on its own, but enough to make a cautious trustee call a lawyer. And we cured it where that panic would go straight to the short list of people who received regular donor reports from the very charities the trust fed, while Marcus lit the wires. I did what I always do when the loom gets louder: human work. I walked the groundwork. I called in favors with the kind of blunt phone calls that trade memory for leverage. There's a woman in the legal world, Drina, who used to file $1 million trust registrations for men who preferred anonymity. She'd once told me over cheap wine that people like Maddox had the comfort of 1,000 signatures filed under someone else's name. She knew the registrar's nicknames and the handwritten idiosyncrasies of certain trust managers. For what felt like a pittance, she pulled names that read like breadcrumbs: Fairfax Capital Trust, Crownbridge Partners, Larchmere Holdings. Old families that liked new things. The first reaction we wanted was bureaucratic. Make a trustee nervous enough to pull the file and find something sloppy. When trustees ask for audits, something like light filters down. Once the light is on, men with money either wrestle with transparency or they buy influence. We needed to make them choose in public. We set the trap at a fundraiser, the kind of gilded event where fortunes whisper to one another and the gift cards of influence change hands in rooms scented by old wood and expensive perfume. Danvers, the journalist who owed me a favor for a past scoop, agreed to show up with a camera and a question. Not an obvious one. A gentle prod about donor lists and the due diligence pipeline. He'd ask the right person the wrong question and let the sound of it settle over the room. Marcus would pretend to be a low-level auditor at the back, discover a sloppily filed receipt, and act surprised loud enough that people would notice. Small ripples became sudden ripples, and sudden ripples yanked nets tight. It worked almost too well. On the second night after the fundraiser, I received two things simultaneously: a terse email from an address in a shell company with a one-word subject line "stop" and a more tangible sign that things had changed. Someone had tried to break into my car. Not to steal, precisely. The glove box had been rifled, and a photograph left behind: Ethan, clutching his head in a hotel corridor, surrounded by half a dozen men in suits I didn't recognize. The photo's back had a stamped address in a part of town I'd once thought safe. They were escalating. The loom was responding. We pushed back. Marcus spun up a phantom ledger that mimicked one of Maddox's smaller conduits and let it leak through one of the fake charities. Within 48 hours, the trustee we'd nudged got nervous and scheduled a private review. That review triggered an internal email thread that used a language only someone in their inner circle would parse. Marcus hooked into the thread and extracted an IP that pinged to a virtual private host in Geneva. Geneva is a word that opens doors. Men with Swiss accounts get nervous when Geneva issues an untraceable ping. We had something, a geography, but we needed names. Paper moves slower than IPs. And names are what force a hand in the human world. That's when Claire walked back into the room and turned the air brittle. She found me in a cheap hotel room I'd rented for 3 nights. I was going through ledger prints, indexes, maps. She sat down across from me as if she'd fallen into the wrong movie. For months she'd been a patient collaborator in my revenge. I'd used her access on the edges. Now, sitting across from me, she looked smaller, the lines in her face like an accusation. "You put us in more danger," she said quietly. "They said they'd make someone disappear. They showed me photos." Her voice trembled, but not with fear for herself. Her fingers braided in her cup like prayer beads. "They're not just financiers, Michael. They have hands that are not afraid of breaking things." I wanted to be cold. I wanted to sound as clinical as the pages of the dossiers I filed. But the sight of her hair pulled back, a woman who'd been both my life and my labyrinth and did some of my practiced cruelty. "They showed Ethan in those pictures," I said. "That's a message. They want us to see what they can make happen. Do you regret it?" she asked. The question landed like a blade. Not did you regret what he did, but did you regret what you made happen in response? I had no honest answer. Maybe I did regret the taste of it. Maybe I feared the price. But I knew I could not stop. The net had become a machine that measured your desperation and took currency accordingly. Retreat felt like handing a note of surrender they'd frame and hang above a fireplace. No, I had built momentum. I would run it through. We moved on another vector. People who cleaned their mess, enforcers, fixers, the foot soldiers of the tidy world. Men like Gideon Voss, the sort of man you hear about at bar tables when the whiskey is cheap and the conspiracy is free-flowing. I didn't want Gideon's kind to be unknown. I wanted them to feel visible. Marcus found a courier who'd once worked with a small firm that did disposal logistics. He took payments with cash, but he kept receipts he thought nobody would trace. The courier, careless and brittle, had been photographed by a traffic camera in the area where one of Maddox's shell shipments came through. The photograph linked Gideon's hands to a legal locker in the city and an address with a camera that had recorded a handoff labeled in a ledger as Hololine. Hololine, the same phrase I'd seen in another memo, was a euphemism they used to describe projects that needed plausible deniability. We struck at the locker at dawn. Samira, my surveillance woman, the asset with patience and a motorcycle, hovered 3 blocks away in Reen, her camera a patient animal. The courier came, opened the locker, slipped a crate inside, and left. The crate had the vendor's logo. Our cameras caught hands, palms, sleeve tattoos, a ring that registered to a man who appears on paper as consultant but publicly is a trustee of a children's charity. We had proof that men who smiled at galas also handled crates. That evening I slept badly, with the city breathing like a beast outside my window. The evidence we'd gathered moved like a silver thread. IPs to Geneva, trustees in private rooms, courier hands in lockers. We enlarged it, highlighted it, abstracted it into a narrative credible enough to fracture a boardroom's calm. And then the payback came in the single worst way possible. Collateral. Marcus's sister, an accountant, innocent in the way accountants sometimes are, was arrested at the airport on a charge contrived to be humiliating. Tax irregularities dating back 3.5 years. A paper trail forged and pressed into prosecutorial hands. Marcus called me before the plane took off, voice ragged. "They came through the margins," he said. "Small, technical crimes. They plant paper that looks like error, and then they bring you an orderly prosecution." His sound was brittle. He'd handled dark corners of the web for years and still hadn't been able to shield his family. That was the thing about the net. When you pull on a thread, the pressure radiates. People you care about get caught in the weave. I could have called the bureau. I could have injected evidence, leverage, a counterpressure. But I'd learned something more dangerous in the quiet months. The institutions you imagine will protect you fold like an accordion when the right men whisper to the right chair. I had to play the game they played. shove consequence into the hands of trustees who prefer not to be inconvenienced. So, I did the only thing I could think to do that night. I sat in a cheap diner with Marcus and wrote down a list of trustees who'd been mentioned in donations to Hololine projects. I hand-delivered one of the curated packets to a trustee who'd once been vocal about governance. We made the problem not a legal problem, but a reputational tick, a thing that kills donations in places that measure themselves in legacies. By morning, the trustee's office called an emergency meeting. By afternoon, there were questions across the network about donors who valued silence. Marcus's sister was released on a technicality 2 days later. The process cost more than money. It cost patience, it cost sleep, and it put us deeper in their sight line. We'd bought Marcus time and bought a single man's life back. It was a victory with no spoils. It also paved our path up a floor of the loom. Because men who value money also value control. When trustees move money, they don't like to be embarrassed. They react. The reaction came as a violent, precise reminder. A car fired 2 blocks from where I had left a laptop with mirrored files. Not random. Someone had set up a device to scorch but not explode. The laptop was a decoy. The real drives were in a safety deposit box 30 miles away. The scorched laptop was a message. We can burn what you think is safe. That night, after the flames died and the city smelled like melted plastic and ash, I lay awake and thought of the loom. Pull one thread and feel the whole thing move. The question had stopped being whether I could tear the net down. It had become whether I could tear it down and survive. What it asks you to become in return. There are moments in this work when you wonder if you have the courage to watch people you love suffer for a cause you cannot explain without sounding unhinged. I watched Marcus sleep that night like someone who'd been wounded in an old war and couldn't let go. I watched Claire press her hands together and whisper apologies she did not mean. And yet, when dawn came, I opened a new file and called Danvers. We make them play, I said. We force them to sweat. We make the trustees choose transparency or contagion. He replied, calm and hungry. When do I publish? I gave him a date 2 weeks out. Enough time for panic to push the wrong button. Enough time for a trustee to expose himself publicly. Enough time for Maddox's men to step invisibly and, in doing that, to show their hands to the world. 2 weeks is an eternity when men have guns and 10 minutes when men have consequences. So I sharpened patience into an edge and waited. Pulling the loom is an act of faith that the network's arrogance will be its undoing, that pride will blind them into making mistakes. I'd already seen it in Ethan's panic. I'd seen it in Gideon's career. The net learns, yes, but so do hunters. The next move would be louder than leaking a ledger. The next move would make a name matter in ways this city's trustees could not ignore. It would be a public calculus, not a private whisper. When you start unweaving something that binds 1,000 men, you don't always know whether the final cut will liberate or destroy. But I did know one iron truth. I had reached the point of no return. The loom had noticed me. It had answered. Now, I would make it show all of its hands. They say the city learns to be quiet around none like Maddox. That's wrong. The city never learns quiet. It learns camouflage. It reorders itself, so the parts that matter hide behind the things that look harmless. Foundations, charities, wine cellars, committee seats. When you pull one visible thread, the quiet parts move faster than you can see. They don't shout. They reposition. They send other people to do their dirty work. 2 weeks until publication. 2 weeks for trustees to twitch and for panic to make men make mistakes. 2 weeks for me to prepare for the moment they showed their hands. I spent the first of those 2 weeks turning every safe place into a false refuge. I moved drives, fractured my footprints, switched names on deposit boxes. I built redundancies not because I trusted them to hold, but because I needed them to fail on my schedule. If a drive burned, there had to be mirrors warm enough to complete the story. If I vanished, the story could not disappear with me. Marcus was the first to pay a price. The flyers we had seeded, accurate enough to prick, juicy enough to worry, made his sister's case wobble around the edges of prosecution. Her release was a temporary reprieve, but the enemies who took the time to frame her had shown how far they'd go. He swore at me once in the dark of a parking lot, the kind of oaths men use when they don't know whether they're mourning or promising. "We are on the same side," he said, but his voice had the tremor of someone who'd seen the claws under the velvet. Then the noise began. Danvers ran the first piece on a Tuesday morning, not a scream, but a forensic essay that read like a concision. He described anomalies in donor flows, cross-referenced vendor payments, and closed with a deceptively casual question about an obscure trust who benefits from hollow-line stabilization. The piece landed on trustee desks like a sandbag. Phones lit up. Meetings were scheduled. Trustees made their lowest-level lawyers call for emergency audits. The chain reaction I'd built began to hum, and then they struck back. The first strike was ugly in a way that showed practice. My car's rear tire slashed on a Sunday morning. 2 days later, an arsonist took a grocery store to blocks from a server farm I used for proxies. Flames contained, but enough to force the rental office to review security footage. They put pressure on the proxies. They put pressure on the people around me. Pressure makes seals snap. The second strike was cleaner and worse. Claire's boss called an emergency HR meeting after an anonymous email suggested compromised associations. They asked Claire for her accounts, her travel dates, her email backups. She handed them over like someone offering a damp hand to a tribunal. They placed her on paid leave with pending review. That was a kindness meant to shred people quietly, remove them from daily life, isolate them, make them vulnerable. When the men behind the net want to push you off the board, they don't move with guns. They move through permission. They move through contracts and legal ambiguity and the modest-sounding envelopes that say compliance and carry a small, certain death. We countered the way we always had, with pressure of our own and with the unpleasant truth that men who shine in boardrooms were not immune to exposure. I picked my targets carefully. Not the faces that sat under the chandeliers, not yet. The small men who make money flow quietly were my first cuts. The registrar who handled Jersey shelf filings. The fund manager who arranged microdonations from trusts. The logistics firm that delivered crates marked sensitive electronics to lockers. Names you can find on a long day with the right contacts and the right patience. The registrar folded with a phone call from a retired colleague who offered him a retirement plan he couldn't refuse. The fund manager got a consensual audit arranged by a trustee who hated surprises. The courier's operation, the one that moved the crates, got a year-long regulatory spotlight by someone who felt the embarrassment of association. Each small victory forced them to get quieter, to move operations through more layers. The wealthy, when threatened, don't change behavior. They end layers. But the real movement came when Gideon's men stopped being sloppy. He learned to watch without being watched. He learned to buy silence with methods that didn't leave fingerprints in log files. Men like Gideon are the kind of faders you don't want to be. They remind you simply how fragile your friends can be. He began to show up where our cameras did not have angles. He braved places I thought were invisible, rooftops with maintenance hatches, back alleys with old freight doors, the parking underside of hotels. He wanted me to know he could touch my world. And then he touched Marcus. It was evening. Marcus had gone to a meeting at a diner 2 neighborhoods over with a man who'd promised to put the right pressure on a trustee. They sat in the back. Marcus left with a folder. He never finished his coffee. 2 blocks down, a van cut him off. A black-gloved hand dragged him from the car and shoved him into a vehicle with its plates gone. 3 hours later he was dumped on a highway ramp 2 towns away, shaken and with a fractured rib. They left him on the side of the road like a warning. The note in the glove compartment read, "Stop." Marcus came back with more fury than fear. There's a difference. Some people get scared and fold. Others get the animal light in their eyes. Marcus had the animal light. He wanted to strike until the wolf had no teeth. He wanted to pay in the same currency they used, fear. I stopped him. We planned smarter. The ledger we'd prepared for Danvers' next piece got sharper. We found a trustee who'd had enough reputation to be precious, a philanthropist who'd rather give away money than have his name smeared in a scandal. We slid him a curated packet, calendar entries, payment memos, a single photograph of a crate handoff, the same crates we'd filmed at the locker. The trustee made calls. The calls made men in Zurich breathe like someone who just swallowed smoke. It worked. A trustee pulled his money. A patron withdrew a pledge. A donor's office asked the charity to explain its vetting. Trustees who once drank wine together now placed phone calls in private and asked different questions. Men who liked neat rooms discovered termites. The loom flinched. The price, again, came in human currency. Samira started sleeping with a pistol under a towel. She stopped eating in restaurants. She learned to be 19 again, young, alert, hard to read. Claire called one night in tears because someone had left a picture of her walking out of a townhouse on the windshield of her car. The image had been taken from a camera I didn't own and posted to a private account. Whoever had made it had access to resources I hadn't. And that fact made me think about everything else I didn't know. We had a plan for the big move, the strike that would cut the loom's cord and force the hands behind it into the daylight. The plan required something I'd never thought I would trade for, a face and a confession. I needed a person inside their system who was willing to burn paper and turn state's evidence. I needed someone like Claire to go deeper than she already had, and to make someone at their core sweat the same heat I felt every night. She agreed. Not because she loved me. I don't know anymore whether love lives in people like us, but because she wanted to be done. She wanted a life that didn't include blackmail notes and photographs on windshields. She had known I was pushing. She had known the risks. She had watched her name used as bait. She had been frightened enough and angry enough to help. We set the hook at a gala one November night, an event filled with polished shoes and soft lighting. It was the kind of place where trustees felt safe because they paid for the security of 1,000 tiny illusions. Maddox's men would be there. Gideon's courier network would be nearby. The idea was simple. Let them think we were doing something small and easy, a donation handshake. A handshake into a locker, and then make the small handoff explode into public knowledge. Claire. Under the official watchdog program the Bureau had agreed to run quietly with Ephraim's nudging, would arrange a meeting place, leave the one piece of evidence they had demanded, and then sit with a reporter in a corner. The night came. I wore a suit that felt like armor and didn't look at a single face for more than a second. Claire moved like someone walking on glass. Precise, quiet, scarred. Danvers blended into the press cluster with his camera, a soft animal that knows how to stay still. Ephraim's people watched from the back, grave and white-collared, their presence thin but reassuring. Claire made the exchange in a brown envelope patched with tape. The man who took it, a courier who smelled of cheap cologne and authority, left with the packet. He tapped his phone. Gideon's silhouette was in the crowd. You don't stage these things without risk. You stage them because the risk is the door. We followed the courier to a parking garage where a black sedan waited. Gideon watched the car like a man savoring a meal. He slid into the driver's seat and tapped the envelope. The car moved into the dark. Samira's bike trailed. Ours was a pattern she could read by sound and by breath. Then everything went wrong, or rather exactly as we'd built it to force a mistake. When Gideon stopped at a red light, a town car cut him off from the side and forced him to swerve into a loading bay. Men in suits, but not suit men. Those men who looked like couriers of consequence closed in around Gideon. They demanded the envelope. Gideon, pride flaring, reached inside the glove compartment for a pistol. That pistol wasn't registered in any database he'd assumed to trust. It was a trade in a locker somewhere in Queens. The men who had stopped him struck first and silent. A one-to move that left him with a broken cheek and a smear of blood on his lip. They split his attention and took the envelope. The then that had forced Gideon off the lane peeled away like a speedster. My feet caught the license plate, trunk in a service database, and moving east toward a private pier. Gideon cursed and followed. His men called him. He barked orders. Pride had led him into a feeding. We trailed, careful as a surgeon. Claire had a place to be when the envelope left. And Danvers' camera had the courier's hands in crystal detail. The envelope went to a private dock where a water taxi waited with blankets on the seat and a man reading a paper. The man looked like a trustee and smelled faintly of eucalyptus. That was the moment I felt the room ledger in my chest shift. We had the trustee in a live photo. He was someone with philanthropic taste and a vanity that would not accept scandal. That man belonged to the type who buys reputation like a garment, off the rack, expensive, carefully returned when stained. We followed the trail across the harbor and into a warehouse with polished wood and chandeliers. The kind of place that asks you to forget the docks outside. The envelope was opened. The document inside was thin and clinical, a memo with bank routing numbers and a directive called Hololine Deployment Authorization. It had a signature line and a name that mattered in a way I'd long chased. C. Maddox. Danvers filmed the envelope in broad daylight. Ephraim had conservative officers waiting in case someone tried to move the evidence. The scene had the outcome of a raid that had not yet been announced. Gideon's men were furious. The trustee was pale. Maddox's name was there in ink. That should have been the moment the loom unraveled. It was not. It was the moment the loom revealed something worse. As Ephraim's team moved in, 2 men in the warehouse slipped into a back room and came out with a battered case. The case contained cameras that looked like toys and a small black device that began emitting a steady, low-frequency hum. The hum overloaded the radio's electronics faltered. Our feed blacked out for 30 seconds, not long in time, but long enough to mean the difference between arrest and escape. When the feed returned, the trustee was gone. The envelope was shredded. Gideon was being comforted by 2 men with spotless suits and with filthy hands. I remember the taste in my mouth that night, copper and regret. They had thought of everything. They had a countermeasure for my counters. The loom had taught the loom how to move faster. We retreated, bruised and smarter. The trustee's name was now in 3 secure drives to safety deposit boxes, and the hands of a journalist who had the patience to hold his peace until the net made a fatal mistake. Danvers sat with his camera and looked like an animal who had nearly been bait. He had the footage of the envelope and the container and the device that had silenced us. The city hummed with possibility. Behind closed doors, men in suits whispered to men with offshore accounts. We had a photo of Maddox's signature and a shredded envelope that had been photographed before it was ruined. We had a path rough, jagged, not clean enough for a court but enough for trustees with reputations to lose. But the price of that night arrived in 3 small acts. First, Sumner's mother's front door was smashed in. 2 days later, nothing taken, a sheet with a single word pinned to the curtains: move. They meant we should stop. They meant we should move. They meant they would touch the people we loved. Second, Marcus's sister, who had just been released, had her bank account frozen in an audit labeled suspicious activity. The message was unmistakable. We can make your salvation a legal process that stays with you. They could make chaos feel like paperwork, and paperwork is killing in a modern world. Third, a photograph appeared on my kitchen table the next morning. Not an anonymous mail drop this time, but a glossy, professional print. It showed Dylan, the old partner who'd been useful, the man who'd been found in a car months earlier, alive in a manufactured photo, sitting in a motel room with the label we remember. Somebody had found a way to make the dead ambiguous and the absent present. The photo had a line on the back in a handwriting our analyst recognized as practiced. Stop. I burned the photo in the sink and watched the edges blacken. The flame eat it with a soft hiss. The smell of it clung to my fingers, and for the first time since this began, I couldn't tell whether burning something felt like cleaning or confession. The loom had learned to strike back where it hurt, our people, our small comforts. The flimsy safety nets we'd built around each other, they could make the world uncomfortable enough that the edges of morality sharpened into knives. They had shown us pain, we had shown them a leak. We were no longer just hunters. We were now a thing they would hunt carefully. That fact settled over me like a winter coat. It was weighty and inevitable. The plan didn't end, it changed. We couldn't blindside them with one more folder. They would expect that. We had to make them expose themselves in a room where the light was impossible to ignore. So we prepared the final stage of our 2-week window. Not a trap to catch a courier, not a sting for a trustee, but a full exposure that would force a public decision. Either pay the price of scandal in public and matter, or accept a slow suffocation in private and stop funding the machine. Either choice would break alliances. Either choice would leave bodies to be carried. I drew the map on a fresh page. I circled names and times and dates and thought of the people who'd already bled for this. Marcus, Samira Danvers, Claire. I thought of Dylan's photo in the sink. I thought of the taste of burning paper. We would pull the loom in a way that left nothing ambiguous. We would force a trustee to make a public statement. We would make Maddox's name a thing that could not be whispered away into the dark. And if the loom fought back, we were ready to break more than cables. We would break the illusions that protected men who believed they were untouchable. The next morning, I climbed on a bus and watched neighborhoods slide by like chapters. The city is full of bones. People live on the structures others forget. I had a ledger of names and a heart that felt my ribs when I breathed. The loom had noticed. It had struck. It had cost us blood. We were still standing. That, for the moment, was enough. 2 days until the public move. 2 days for men who thought themselves gods to decide whether to keep their hands clean or take the blame. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl into the air like a small, decisive flag. The noise that came next would decide things I could not yet imagine. The cut I was about to make had to be precise. It had to fall on the center of the loom's knot. If it failed, the consequences would be private and ocean-deep. If it succeeded, we would have opened a hole in something that protected the city's wealthy and cruel. Either way, the world would not go back to the way it had been. The only question left was, who would survive the learning curve? They say vengeance has a sound. That's wrong. It has a silence, the kind that hums in your bones before the first move is made. The night before it happened, I sat in my apartment, staring at the final board. The evidence, the recordings, the name lists, all lined up like little gravestones on my desk. Claire slept in the other room, or pretended to. Samira was out mapping exits around the building we would hit. Marcus sat in his car outside, engine idling low, watching the street. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge was personal. This was a reckoning. I'd spent months threading the line between detective and executioner, and by the time I reached that night, I couldn't tell which mask I was still wearing. The mirror in my room didn't show a hero. It showed a man who'd been carved down to function, 39 years old, tired, the kind of tired that doesn't sleep, but just stops thinking. We called it the cut. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't cinematic. It was a data flood. The simultaneous release of everything Maddox's network had hidden. Shell companies, bribes, recorded meetings, audio confessions, routing slips, all uploaded to 100 mirrored nodes, all triggered by one code string. The files were encrypted until I entered a phrase that had lived in my head for weeks. The loom burns. Once the phrase was entered, the city's silence would end. Every quiet transaction, every shadow deal, all of it would become noise. We chose the place deliberately. a marble building that pretended to be a community foundation, sitting smugly between a cathedral and a bank. Maddox's charity had used it for board meetings and photo ops, polished marble, soft lights, clean lies. The next morning, the trustees would meet there to approve a transfer of $30 million into Hololine Stabilization, the same show that funded everything we'd been chasing. We didn't need to steal anything. We just needed them to press send. Danvers would be outside, disguised as press, streaming live. Ephraim would have his men 2 streets over, unofficially observing. Claire would walk in as if she still belonged there, a consultant who had something to deliver. Samira would guard the escape route. Marcus would watch the server feed and trigger the upload. I would stay in the car, the phrase waiting in my mouth like a bullet. Everything depended on timing. At 8:47 a.m. Claire texted a single word. Inside. My stomach twisted. I watched the building through a cracked windshield. She walked past security, a folder under her arm, hair tied, expression neutral. I could read the nerves in the tension of her shoulders. Maddox was already there, his black car parked in the rear, license plate half obscured. He'd come early, probably thinking the world still bent for him. Through the earpiece, I heard Danvers whisper, visual confirmed. They're starting. Inside, the trustees took their seats, glasses of water glinting under artificial light. Maddox began with the same calm he always used. We move forward today with unity. No distractions. But there was a distraction. Claire placed a USB drive on the table and said, evenly, "These are the final compliance forms." What she didn't say was that the USB contained a ghost of virus built to mirror and duplicate every piece of data it touched. Once plugged in, it would silently upload to our system, then purge itself, leaving nothing visible except normal documents. Maddox wouldn't suspect a thing. I saw him lift the drive, plug it in, and that's when everything started to happen at once. Marcus's voice came through the comms, shaking. "We're live. That is copying. We've got full access." I opened my laptop and watched the mirrored drive populate with folders. Donor_ledger, Zurich_accounts, project_CRULAN. Then suddenly, a second feed appeared, not ours. Someone else was inside the system. "They've got a washer," Marcus hissed. "They're trying to ghost the transfer. Can you isolate it?" I asked, trying. It's coming from inside the building." The next second stretched. Through the binoculars, I saw Gideon walk through the door. He was dressed like security, earpiece, jacket, calm arrogance. He'd figured it out. "Abort," I said. "No," Clara whispered. "Too late. He's here, inside." Gideon placed a hand on her shoulder. He smiled like a man who already knew the ending. "You always were too clever, Claire." Maddox stood. "What is this?" Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered. Marcus had triggered the upload anyway, a desperate move. The servers surged, the Wi-Fi strained, and then the feed went public. Danvers's live stream lit up. Screens all over the world, journalists, investors, regulators, suddenly filled with spreadsheets, memos, and the unmistakable signature of C. Maddox. The loom was burning. Maddox's voice roared through the earpiece. "Shut it down." Too late. The data was everywhere. Then chaos. One of Maddox's guards drew a gun. Claire dove for the floor. Gideon tackled her, shouting into his radio. Through the comms came the sound of gunfire, muffled, distant, wrong. My vision tunneled. I threw the car door open and ran toward the entrance. Samira was shouting something behind me, but I didn't hear her. When I burst through the lobby, smoke was already crawling across the ceiling. The server room had been rigged a failsafe, a last resort to destroy evidence. Flames lit through the vents. I saw Claire crawling, coughing, dragging herself toward the exit. Gideon stood over her, pistol raised. I didn't think. I tackled him. The shot went wild, shattering a chandelier. The gun skidded across the floor. Gideon's elbow caught my jaw, a white flash of pain. I drove my knee into his ribs, heard something crack. "Still playing detective?" He spat blood. "Still losing," I said. and slammed his head against the marble. Claire pulled herself up, trembling. "We have to go, Marcus," I called. Static. Then his voice, faint, "Upload complete. Go." We ran. Smoke, sirens, people screaming. Danvers caught us outside, cameras still streaming, tears in his eyes. "It's done," he said. "It's everywhere." Behind us, the building burned. The marble cracked, glass exploding outward in shimmering arcs. Maddox's empire died the way he'd built it, quietly, expensively, beautifully destructive. The aftermath was the kind that doesn't make headlines, not right away. 3 trustees resigned that week. 2 were indicted. Maddox disappeared. A warrant with his name sent to every border agency. Gideon's body was never found. The police found blood matching his DNA, but no corpse. Marcus was in the hospital. Concussion, smoke inhalation. He'd live. Claire vanished 2 days after she gave her testimony. Witness protection, they said. She left me a note in handwriting I didn't recognize at first. "You got what you wanted. Don't come looking for me." Samir left the city. Danvers sold his footage to an outlet and vanished behind NDAs. Me, I stayed. Someone had to watch the ashes. It's been a year since that morning. Maddox's name still circulates in whispers. Some call me a vigilante, some call me a liar. Doesn't matter. The story outlived all of us. Some nights I walked past the new building they'd built on the same lot. Glass, flowers, a plaque that says "For the advancement of community," a lie dressed in marble again. The city rebuilt its silence. It always does, but under it, in the dark parts of the web, the files still move. The code phrase still lives. The loom burns. Copies of the truth that won't die. And when I sit in the dark with a drink in my hand, I think about Claire's voice, calm, certain, the night before it all went down. She'd said, "When you burn something that big, you can't stay to watch the smoke." I stayed anyway, not because I wanted to, because someone had to remember what the silence cost, because vengeance doesn't end when you get what you want. It ends when there's nothing left to take. And when the loom burned, all that was left was me.